Hello and welcome to the MainView for IMS Quick Course Training Series. My name is Trish Nolan and I am a MainView software consultant. In this session you will learn how to display, start, and stop your IMS traces within MainView for IMS. We will now begin to manage our IMS traces by accessing the Easy Eye admin menu. You may access this menu from any point within the MainView for IMS product by typing the letters EZIADMIN on your command line and pressing the Enter key. When the Easy Eye admin menu is displayed, on the left-hand side under the Trace Admin section, you will place your cursor on the Current Traces option to display those traces that are currently active within your IMS subsystems. The Current Traces view shows all traces that are currently active for your IMS subsystem. Here we can see we have an abbreviated, detail, and summary trace that is active on this subsystem. Let's drill down on the trace ID of summary by placing our cursor on the word summary and pressing Enter. The Trace Summary by Transaction view summarizes all the transactions that were captured in your trace by transaction code. On this view you can see the transaction code, the count of the number of transactions that were captured for each transaction code, the append count, response time, elapsed time, and more. For this demonstration, we will drill down on the transaction count of 573 to list all the detailed transactions for that particular transaction code. Place your cursor on a transaction count and press Enter. The Trace Summary view presents a list of all the transactions that were captured for the particular transaction code on a list. To see more detailed information about a particular transaction, place your cursor on the transaction code and press the Enter key. The Transaction Summary Data view displays detailed information about the selected IMS transaction. In the System Information section, you can see the IMS ID, where the transaction ran, and the IMS job name that executed the transaction. You will also see additional detail-level transaction information and DC call activity. Press your PF8 key to scroll down and see additional detail-level information. Here you can see the DL1 call activity, the FastPath activity if applicable, and event timing information. Press your PF8 key once again to scroll down and see more information. Press your PF8 key one more time to scroll down and see the CPU times related to this transaction. Now we will return to the Easy Eye admin menu in MainView for IMS to start an IMS trace. Place your cursor on the Start Trace option under the Trace Admin section and press your Enter key. We will specify trace criteria information on the next few panels. Start with the target field in the upper right-hand corner of this panel. Verify that the region name shown here is the region where you want to start your trace. Enter a 1 to 8 character trace name in the PARM field. In the Type field, specify the type of trace to start. Enter an S for a summary trace, D for a detail trace, or A for an abbreviated summary trace. For this example, we will start a summary trace. Specify when you want the trace to begin in the Start field. You can specify a start time up to 24 hours in advance, and the trace will not start until that time is reached. If you leave this field blank, the trace will begin as soon as you finish specifying the trace criteria. In the Stop field, you can specify the amount of time you want the trace to run or an actual stop time. If you do not enter a value in this field, you must stop the trace manually. Enter the number of buffers to hold the trace data before it is written to DASD in the Storage field. We recommend that you use your installation defaults for this parameter. In the Log Trace field, specify whether you want to log the trace data to DASD. We recommend that you specify Y in this field. Use the Wrap field to indicate how you want to wrap the data in memory when the memory fills. Enter a value in the RST field to indicate how you want to handle the trace if MainView is brought down while the trace is running. If you want the trace to be restarted with the same parameters when MainView restarts, enter hot. If you do not want to restart the trace and you want to purge any previously collected trace data, enter pur or PUR. If you do not want to restart the trace, but you want to preserve any data that was previously collected by the trace, enter QIS for QIS. Enter a name for the trace in the title field. Now let's move on to the Specify Additional Trace Options area. Enter a Y in the Selection Criteria field to be able to specify additional IMS trace criteria. If you want to specify criteria for filtering the trace records that are written to the trace datasets, you should specify a Y in the Exception Filters field. This will limit the data which is written to the output trace files to only that data which matches the specified exception criteria. To log the trace data to a physical DASD file, specify Y in the Trace Log Dataset Options field. After you have completed entering the fields on this panel, press Enter to continue. On the IMS Trace Selection Criteria panel, specify the IMS programs, transaction types, transaction IDs, and other parameters to qualify the IMS workloads you wish to trace. As you can see, wildcard characters are accepted also. Once you have entered the trace criteria you want, press Enter. On the IMS Exception Filters Criteria panel, enter any filtering parameters you want to limit the amount of data which is written to the output trace files. If the workload you are tracing match any of the specified criteria, the transaction records will be written to the output trace. Press Enter when you have completed the desired criteria on this panel. Specify Trace Log Dataset options on this panel. Enter the number of datasets you want to write the trace data to in the Number of Logs field. You can provide a dataset name for the trace log datasets in the First Log DSN field, or you can take the installation default, which is highlighted in white. If you specify a dataset name, you must ensure that MainView for IMS has the appropriate RACF, ACF2, or top secret authority to allocate and write to that file. Additionally, the last node of the dataset name you supply must end in .v01, otherwise the trace will not start. To overwrite trace log datasets when they become full, enter Y in the Overwrite Logs field. If you want the logs to switch at a particular time, enter that time in the Log Switch Time field. In the Disposition field, enter New if you are creating new trace log datasets, or Old if you are reusing existing trace log datasets. If you are not using SMS, provide the volume IDs in the Volume field to indicate where the trace log datasets will be allocated. If you are using SMS, leave this field blank and provide SMS information in the appropriate fields. Enter the number of cylinders needed when allocating the trace log dataset in the Primary Cylinders field. The value you enter in the Data DSN suffix field will be appended as the last node on the data component of the VSAM log dataset name. Press Enter to return to the Start IMS Trace Request panel. Once you return to the Start IMS Trace Request panel, you must press Enter one more time to process the start request for that trace. The Current Traces panel now displays the trace we started. If you specified the trace to start at a later point in time, the status field will show init. To stop the trace, enter the letter Z to the left of the trace name and press Enter. You will then receive a message indicating that the trace has been stopped. To review the trace in the Current Traces panel, place your cursor on the trace name and press Enter. The Transaction Summary Trace Review panel shows all the transactions which were captured in the trace. You can see the number of transactions in the count field, response time, elapsed time, and more. To review records for a particular transaction, place your cursor on the count field for that transaction and press Enter. You can now see all of the individual transactions in the trace file for the transaction code that you chose. To review details for a particular transaction, place your cursor on the Tran code column and press the Enter key. Now you can see the transaction summary data for the transaction code that you selected. Press the PF8 key to scroll down and review all of the provided information. For more information, you can go to our website at www.bmc.com/support/product-documentation. Thank you very much.